Should have done this behind the scenes. It's the most nervous I'll be this morning is the fact that I got to wear this thing because I've never worn it before and I don't want to get strangled by it. So, if we would, I'll go ahead and ask David to lead us in a word of prayer if he doesn't mind.
Our Father, we're thankful for this very beautiful morning today and for the opportunity we now have to study more of your word. We pray that you'll be with Darrell as he directs our study this morning and you'll help us to remember what he prepared. We pray that you'll help each of us keep an open mind and we can better understand your word. We would also pray for the ones that are not able to be here today because of illness. We pray that you'll give them extra strength so they can see them back with us if it is your will. We pray now that you'll be with us in our study in Jesus' name.
Thank you. All right, well, I don't see any visitors, but if we have any, I'm not the normal person that's up here, so bear with me, but we're going to do our best to get through a couple chapters of Judges this morning. I got a lot to get through. I went from thinking that I wouldn't have enough to, that you wouldn't be getting out at like 20 after to thinking that it might be 20 after 10, so Amy told me when the bell rang I had to stop, so we'll go ahead and get started here. There probably won't be a lot of time for questions, but if there is anything that comes up, feel free to interrupt me. So, starting with the introduction. So we're in Judges 14 and 15 today, and we'll be continuing our lesson on Samson that John Forshee started us with last week. So if we look back to last week, John introduced Samson to us. We remember that the theme of the book of Judges continues. We recall from the first verse of chapter 13 that the people of Israel again did what was evil in the sight of the Lord. And the Lord gave them into the hands of the Philistines for 40 years. Following Samson's birth, verses 24 and 25 of chapter 13 indicated that the Lord blessed Samson and the Spirit of the Lord was upon him. We gather that God has a plan for Samson to rise up and deal with the Philistines. And of course, all of us who were fortunate enough to be going to services, at a young age, remember the story of Samson from our Bible classes. So, just a brief synopsis of what that is, and I assume that everyone had the same type of class that I did. And I'm not talking 15, 16 years old. I'm talking like 4 or 5 years old. So we remember that. Okay, God has a plan for him to deal with the Philistines, and that's exactly what he'll do. Because of his long hair, he has an overwhelming amount of strength, enough that he can kill lions and men with very limited weaponry, even as little as his bare hands. What a hero this Samson fella is. If it weren't for the fact that no razor was to come upon him, surely he would have had an S shaved into his chest, okay? Because he's the Superman of today, all right? All children should admire his great strength and strive to be just like him, right? Someone that we can look up to, and this strong, burly man. But as the great Lee Corso would say in the ESPN College Game Day studio before putting on his famous headgear on Saturday morning, not so fast, my friends. So if you don't understand that, there's a show that goes on before college football kicks off on Saturdays, and typically the best game of the week that they feel is going to be the best game, they go through and analyze it right at the very end of the show. And so the first two guys talk about who they think's going to win, And then oftentimes, if it's the case that Lee's he's the last one to go, of course, that he's going to pick the underdog. He'll talk about how great the other team is, and then he'll say, but not so fast, my friends, and he'll slam on the mascot of the team that no one expects him to. Okay, so if you didn't understand my joke there, that better explains it. So like I say, what we learned as a youngster, we're going to dive a little deeper today, and maybe we affirm that, maybe we find something a little different than what we expect. I'm going to kind of break it out into a few verses at a time. We'll read those verses and then we'll discuss them. So the first section I have is chapter 14, verses 1 through 4. Samson went down to Timnah, and at Timnah he saw one of the daughters of the Philistines. Then he came up and told his father and mother, I saw one of the daughters of the Philistines at Timnah. Now get her for me as my wife. But his father and mother said to him, Is there not a woman among the daughters of your relatives, or among all our people, that you must go to take a wife from the uncircumcised Philistines? But Samson said to his father, Get her for me, for she is right in my eyes. His father and mother did not know that it was from the Lord, that he was seeking an opportunity against the Philistines. And at that time, the Philistines ruled over Israel. So as the chapter begins, much to our surprise, Samson sought a Philistine wife. The thought of Samson marrying a daughter of the enemy, per se, whom we expect Samson to defeat, certainly comes as a surprise. Verses 2 and 3 indicate that his parents did not approve of the Philistine wife. We can almost hear them reasoning with Samson. Can't you find a wife from among our people? Why instead do you have to seek a wife from the uncircumcised Philistines? Not only was Samson breaking standard public policy of marrying the enemy, he was also violating the law, which prohibited Israelites from marrying outsiders. Verse 4 indicates that the Lord would use Samson's marriage to the Philistine bride as an opportunity against the Philistines. So I guess this begs the question. Did God make Samson lust after the girl from Timnah in order to carry out his plan? Most certainly not. God, who is incapable of doing wrong, would not urge Samson to seek a wife from the uncircumcised Philistines against his own instructions in the law. However, God had a plan to use Samson to begin to save Israel from the hand of the Philistines. That's back from last week, verse 5 of chapter 13. God did not cause Samson to break his law, but instead would use Samson's situation to accomplish his will. So I'm going to move on to verses 5 through 9. Then Samson went down with his father and mother to Timnah, and they came to the vineyards of Timnah, and behold, a young lion came toward him roaring. Then the Spirit of the Lord rushed upon him, and although he had nothing in his hand, he tore the lion in pieces as one tears a young goat. But he did not tell his father or his mother what he had done. Then he went down and talked with the woman, and she was right in Samson's eyes. After some days he returned to take her, and he turned aside to see the carcass of the lion, and behold, there was a swarm of bees in the body of the lion, and honey. He scraped it out into his hands, and went on, eating as he went. And he came to his father and mother, and gave some to them, and they ate. But he did not tell them that he had scraped the honey from the carcass of the lion. So here we read the first account of Samson's incredible strength, and this is, one of the stories that we read as a young child, and we think, wow, this guy's tough. I mean, he takes down this lion with his bare hands, and we certainly have to be impressed by his ability to tear the lion to pieces with only his bare hands. God's almighty strength is witnessed through Samson in this account, as noted in verse 6, where the writer points out that the Spirit of the Lord rushed upon him. So then we go to verses 8 and 9, and I have to say they're kind of disturbing to me. My initial thoughts were, it seemed disgusting to eat honey from the inside of a dead animal. Okay? I know how bad a dead animal can smell once they've laid there for a while. Okay? And the thought of it laying there long enough that stuff's starting to swarm up inside of them, they've been eaten. They're rotten at that point, and we got bees up inside of the carcass, and he takes this honey out and starts eating it. And I'm thinking, I wouldn't want nothing to do with that. But then we go on to read that he didn't tell his parents where the honey came from. And once again, at first I'm thinking, of course he didn't tell his parents where the honey came from. Okay? If he did, there's no way they'd be eating it. What does that mean? Well then, and I think I wouldn't expect them to want to eat honey out of a dead animal any more than I would. But then I read through a commentary and I realized there's a little more to the story. Okay? Other than being disgusting to us, Leviticus chapter 11 prohibited contact with dead animals for the Israelites. So since the honey touched the dead carcass, it was considered unclean, making it off limits for Samson and his parents. Which probably better explains the reason why he chose not to tell his parents where it had come from. So he ignores the law here. Okay? He gets the power of the Lord. He kills this lion, and then he reaps the sweetness of his victory through this honey. But it's unlawful for him to have. Okay, so I think that's very important for us to take from this section. Verses 10 through 18. His father went down to the woman, and Samson prepared a feast there, for so the young men used to do. As soon as the people saw him, they brought 30 companions to be with him. Samson said to them, "Let me now put a riddle to you. If you can tell me what it is within the 7 days of the feast, and find it out, then I will give you 30 linen garments and 30 changes of clothes. But if you cannot tell me what it is, then you shall give me 30 linen garments and 30 changes of clothes." And they said to him, "Put your riddle, that we may hear it." He said to them, "Out of the eater came something to eat, out of the strong came something sweet." And in 3 days they could not solve the riddle. On the 4th day they said to Samson's wife, "Entice your husband to tell us what the riddle is, lest we burn you and your father's house with fire." Wonderful people we see. "Have you invited us here to impoverish us?" And Samson's wife wept over him and said, "You only hate me. You do not love me. You have put a riddle to my people, and you have not told me what it is." And he said to her, "Behold, I have not told my father nor my mother. Shall I tell you?" She wept before him the 7 days that their feast lasted. And on the 7th day he told her, because she pressed him hard. Then she told the riddle to her people, and the men of the city said to him on the 7th day, before the sun went down, "What is sweeter than honey? What is stronger than a lion?" And he said to them, "If you had not plowed with my heifer, you would not have found out my riddle." So we see here 30 Philistines joined Samson and his bride in their celebration. During that feast, Samson proposed the riddle based on his encounter with the lion. The riddle was not just an intellectual exercise, but also offered a financial benefit, as the loser would have to offer 30 garments to the winning party. The Philistine companions couldn't figure out the riddle, so they began pressuring Samson's wife. It even threatened to burn her father's house. After 7 days of weeping, Samson broke down and told his wife the answer to the riddle. His wife told the riddle to her people, who translated it to Samson before the deadline was reached. Samson's clever riddle was paralleled by an even more clever reaction in verse 18. Now, coming from Southeast Ohio, I'd say a large number of our assembly may understand Samson's cleverness here. Samson refers to his wife as a heifer. At first glance, okay, I'm not going to refer to Amy as a heifer, and I don't expect any of you men to do that to your wife either, okay? Probably not a compliment, okay? But hang with me a second and understand, okay? At first glance, that seems like an insult, but actually, a heifer refers to a young female cow that's not yet had a calf. Farmers at this time did not use heifers to plow. When the Philistines plowed, they received the fruits of their labor, which would be in this case the answer to the riddle. Samson was implying that they would not have found out his riddle, except that they had inappropriately used his wife to get the information they desired. So I'm going to finish out the chapter here, verses 19 and 20. And the Spirit of the Lord rushed upon him. He went down to Ashkelon and struck down 30 men of the town, and took their spoil and gave the garments to those who had told the riddle. In hot anger he went back to his father's house. And Samson's wife was given to his companion, who had been his best man. Although Samson knew that his companions had cheated, he was still obligated to award them the prize. Here again, the Spirit of the Lord came upon him mightily, so he could fulfill his obligation. This is the second time the Spirit of the Lord came upon Samson. And not to spoil the next chapter, but the Spirit of the Lord will come upon Samson for a third time, making him the most frequent recipient of this power among the judges. He went down to Ashkelon and murdered 30 men to get their clothes. If the Lord intended his work through Samson to begin the removal of the Philistines, he certainly was accomplishing his task. He's already killed 30. After giving the clothes to his unworthy companions, Samson went back to his father's house in anger. Verse 20 indicates that Samson's wife was given to his companion, who had been his best man. So as far as application goes, that concludes chapter 14. As far as application goes, what's the lesson we can take away from chapter 14? Like I mentioned, we studied in the first few verses of the chapter that Samson chose to seek after and marry a woman that he shouldn't have been going after. Although his parents protested his choice, we read in verses 2 and 3, they ultimately helped him take the Timnite woman as his bride. We can only assume they did this because of the love they had for their child. Parents often find themselves in similar situations today. The cases are too many to count, but often children don't engage in the things or walk in the paths parents have laid out for them. It's important to realize the hope that parents in this situation and the people caught up in sin still have. We see in this chapter that even though Samson went against the law and will of God, that God did not desert him. God stood by him, provided him strength, even as he violated the law. We must realize that God will not give up on us, our children, our friends, whatever the case may be. When we look at Samson's shortcomings and God's willingness not to desert him, we're reminded of the stories in Luke 15 of the lost sheep, the lost coin, and the prodigal son. God is always at work and will not walk away from us, even if we walk away from him. Of course, we realize, just as John mentioned so many times last week, that God is also just, and we must return to him if we expect forgiveness of our shortcomings. So I'm going to move on to chapter 15. We'll do verses 1 through 8 to start with. After some days, at the time of wheat harvest, Samson went to visit his wife with a young goat. And he said, I will go in to my wife in the chamber. But her father would not allow him to go in. And her father said, I really thought that you utterly hated her, so I gave her to your companion. Is not her younger sister more beautiful than she? Please take her instead. And Samson said to them, This time I shall be innocent in regard to the Philistines when I do them harm. So Samson went and caught 300 foxes and took torches, and he turned them tail to tail and put a torch between each pair of tails. And when he had set fire to the torches, he let the foxes go into the standing grain of the Philistines and set fire to the stacked grain and the standing grain. as well as the olive orchards. Then the Philistines said, "Who has done this?" And they said, "Samson, the son-in-law of the Timnite, because he has taken his wife and given her to his companion." And the Philistines come up and burned her and her father with fire. And Samson said to them, "If this is what you do, I swear I will be avenged on you. And after that I will quit." And he struck them hip and thigh with a great blow, and he went down and stayed in the cleft of the rock of Etam. It appears that Samson still thought his marriage was valid in verse 1, as he tells his former father-in-law, "I will go in to my wife in the chamber." Her father didn't let him go in, claimed that he thought Samson utterly hated her. It's easy to see why her father would feel this way after Samson went on a killing spree, following her betraying him regarding the riddle. Okay? Of course, a good father doesn't want him to react that way to his daughter after he's done this, after she betrays him, and then he goes out and kills 30 guys. So he offered his younger daughter to Samson instead. Why? I don't know. One can only assume that he was maybe a little bit scared of the dude. I would be. Of course, we read that Samson refused the offer and decided to take revenge on all the Philistines instead. Without any seeming hesitation or difficulty, Samson caught 300 foxes and tied them together in pairs by their tails with torches between them. After doing so, he turned them loose into the fields and the olive groves, which set fire to them. Since this would have taken strength beyond human abilities, this begs the question: was Samson urged by God to do this, or was this for personal revenge? We talked about this earlier. Just as we don't feel the Spirit caused Samson to lust after the Philistine woman, or to kill the 30 men in the previous chapter, we realize that God didn't prompt the use of foxes to burn the fields. Instead, this is another example of God using the less desirable traits of his chosen to accomplish his task. We're reminded of a similar circumstance when God used the evil intent of Joseph's brothers to do good back in Genesis. Now, obviously, the loss of these crops created quite the economic setback on the Philistines, which caused them to question who had done this to them. Verse 6 indicates that they said to Samson, the son-in-law of the Timnite had done this to them. Although the text doesn't identify who they is, we assume it refers to one or more of the 30 companions from the wedding. Despite the fact that the arsonist was revealed to the Philistines, they were unwilling to confront him and instead burned his former wife and her father with fire. In verse 7, Samson swears he will take revenge on them, but after that he would quit. We all know, as we've studied Samson before, that he didn't quit. Verse 8 of the ESV says that he struck them hip and thigh with a great blow. The NIV says he attacked them viciously and slaughtered many of them. Either way, Samson took revenge on them and put several Philistines to death, even though God reserved all acts of vengeance to himself in Deuteronomy 32, verse 35. As he's done so many times throughout our study, Samson ignored God, in this case ignoring his disapproval of revenge. After this killing spree, Samson, realizing he had angered the Philistines, fled to live in a cleft, also known to us as a cave, in the rock of Etam, which is located in the mountains about 15 miles east of Timnah. And we'll move on to verses 9 through 20. Then the Philistines come up and encamped in Judah and made a raid on Lehi. And the men of Judah said, "Why have you come up against us?" They said, "We have come up to bind Samson, to do to him as he did to us." Then 3,000 men of Judah went down to the cleft of the rock of Etam and said to Samson, "Do you not know that the Philistines are rulers over us? What then is this that you have done to us?" And he said to them, "As they did to me, so have I done to them." And they said to him, we have come down to bind you, that we may give you into the hands of the Philistines. And Samson said to them, swear to me that you will not attack me yourselves. They said to him, no, we will only bind you and give you into their hands. We will surely not kill you. So they bound him with 2 new ropes and brought him from the rock. When he came to Lehi, the Philistines came shouting to meet him. Then the Spirit of the Lord rushed upon him, and the ropes that were on his arms became as flax that has caught in fire, and his bonds melted off his hands. He found a fresh jawbone of a donkey, put out his hand and took it, and with it he struck 1,000 men. And Samson said, with the jawbone of a donkey, heaps upon heaps. With the jawbone of a donkey have I struck down 1,000 men. As soon as he had finished speaking, he threw away the jawbone out of his hand, and that place was called Ramath-Lehi. And he was very thirsty, and he called upon the Lord and said, you have granted this great salvation by the hand of your servant. And shall I now die of thirst and fall into the hands of the uncircumcised? And God split open the hollow place that is at Lehi, and water came out from it. And when he drank, his spirit returned, and he revived. Therefore the name of this was called in Hague. It is at Lehi to this day. And he judged Israel in the days of the Philistines 20 years. So in verses 9 and 10, we see that the Philistines went searching for Samson with the intent of binding him and taking revenge on him. The leader of Judah mustered 3,000 Judeans, not to defend against the Philistines, but rather to go down to the cleft of the rock of Etam to take on one man. So at first we say, okay, he gathers an army of 3,000 men. Probably he's going to go after the Philistines. Instead, he's sending the 3,000 to take on one guy, Samson. They asked Samson in verse 11, do you not know that the Philistines are rulers over us? What then is this that you have done to us? Surely they had to be thinking the Philistines would punish them in revenge for what Samson did. Samson replied, as they did to me, so I have done to them. Their question implied that Samson lacked understanding that the Philistines were rulers over them, but maybe more significantly, implied that they sought appeasement with the Philistines and were not eager to go into battle against them. We expect that the Judeans would join their deliverer, Samson, in the battle against the Philistines. It's obvious that they respected his strength, as they sent 3,000 men to bind him, but they wouldn't assist him in battle. Maybe it's because they saw the upcoming battle as one of personal revenge and not throwing off the Philistine yoke, so to speak. It's also very likely that they no longer expected to be delivered or did not trust Samson to accomplish that task, which I got to say is somewhat understandable based on our study of Samson thus far. He kind of seems to go his own way and do his own thing. In any case, they told Samson in verse 12, we've come down to bind you that we may give you into the hands of the Philistines. This brings up a couple interesting points. One, Judah was willing to give up their strongest Israelite rather than confront the Philistines. And two, Samson did not trust his own countrymen. As he said to them at the end of verse 12, swear to me that you will not attack me yourselves. They swore they wouldn't kill him, but bound him with 2 new ropes and brought him out of the cave. So what is the significance of the 2 new ropes? These would be the strongest ropes, as they had not been weakened by prior use. Verse 14 says, when the Philistines came shouting to meet him, the Spirit of the Lord rushed upon him, and the ropes that were on his arms became as flax that has caught fire, and his bonds melted off of his hands. Samson then found the fresh jawbone of a donkey, took it, and killed 1,000 men with it. A couple of things to note about the text in verses 14 and 15. 1, the Spirit of the Lord rushed upon Samson for a 3rd time. Obviously, the first time we read about earlier when he killed the lion with his bare hands. The second was when he killed the 30 men in Ashkelon and took up their garments. Once again, what an amazing display of strength. The text highlights that this was a fresh jawbone. So what's the significance of that? Once again, Samson violates his Nazirite status by retrieving the jawbone from the carcass of a donkey. In verse 16, Samson displays his modesty by saying a victory rhyme. Obviously, this was anything but modest. Samson's feeling good about himself for what he's accomplished. Look at how strong I am. Look at what I did. And before we judge Samson too harshly, ask yourself if you can honestly say you haven't thought highly of yourself at some point in your life. Possibly when you scored that game-winning basket, or maybe when you took home the homecoming crown. Maybe when you look at that house you live in, maybe that car you drive, or that bank account with your name on it. Instead, Samson should have been praising God for giving him the strength to defeat the Philistine men, just as we should praise God and thank him for our accomplishments in life. In verse 17, he threw away the jawbone out of his hand. We have to wonder, did it finally dawn on Samson that he possessed the jawbone, which caused him to violate his Nazirite status? This chapter ends with Samson fearing death. He became very thirsty and asked God to provide water for him. His call to God reminds us of the overall theme of the book of Judges. Earlier in the book, sinful Israel cried out to the Lord. We've read about that so many times thus far throughout our study this summer. Chapter 3, verse 9, verse 15, chapter 4, verse 3, chapter 6, 6, and verse 7, and then again in chapter 10, verse 10. Now, similar to sinful Israel crying out to the Lord, sinful Samson sought God's help. He realizes he has no hope of survival without God providing for him. Samson prayed the first of two prayers recorded in this narrative. We'll study the second next week in chapter 16, verse 28. I won't speak to the prayer next week, but as for this prayer, I have to say it wasn't to seek divine assistance in defeating the Philistines and removing their oppression on Israel. Instead, it was a self-serving prayer for his own wants and needs. Of course, we read in verse 19 that God answers his prayer and provided water for him, which revived him. So as far as application goes for chapter 15, what's some takeaways that we have? What can we take from chapter 15? First takeaway we already touched on in detail, but it's important enough I'll mention it again. We see how highly Samson feels about himself after killing 1,000 Philistines with the jawbone of a donkey. This provides a good example of how not to act, but rather we should give God the credit for our successes in life. Another takeaway from chapter 15 comes in verse 19. From the account we were given on Samson, he failed to ask God for help in saving Israel from the hands of the Philistines. We don't read that prayer anywhere. In fact, we're not given any real proof that he had any interest in following God's will for him or doing God's work at all. As we've studied so far, he goes against the law. He marries a girl that's unlawful. He's breaking all the rules of his Nazirite status by, which I didn't touch on earlier, but he goes into that vineyard, which is one of the laws of the Nazirite, that he shouldn't have anything from the vine, and he handles dead animals. That's two of the three, and I think we all know that next week we're gonna read of the third, which is that no razor should come upon his head. Sure, he wiped out several Philistines so far, as we've studied today, but none of them up through this point seem to be for the Lord's work, but rather focused on Samson's desire. They're all acts of revenge, or acts of things that he wants to do, not really trying to fulfill the work of God. After killing 1,000 men by the power of the Spirit of the Lord rushing on him, he touts himself in high esteem, giving all the credit to himself and none to God. With all this in consideration, we must realize God still answers his prayer and provides water for him. God easily could have sat back and said, you know what, big boy? You're so strong, so tough. Why don't you figure out a way to hydrate yourself? You don't need my help. But instead, even though Samson probably deserved for God to sit back and say this to him, that's not the response he received from God. And I, for one, am so glad it isn't. You know why I'm so glad it isn't? Because none of us, and I'm taking the liberty to speak for all of us here and to answer for me and every one of you, none of us deserve God's grace and mercy that he's provided through Jesus. The hope that I see when God, without hesitation, answers Samson's prayer and saves him when he probably didn't deserve it gives me the hope that he will save me when I don't deserve it either. So I'm going to close this lesson the same way I started it. Relatively early. By considering the story of Samson from our childhood Bible classes, Samson was one bad dude, a strong, powerful, heroic man who single-handedly took down the Philistines because of the power he received through his hair that had never been cut. Not so fast, my friends. He was, for lack of better terms, a stinker. A stinker that God didn't turn his back on. And oh, the hope that should give each and every one of us, because, let's be honest, we can all be stinkers from time to time. As for his power, from my perspective, the only thing his hair had to do with it was the obedience and commitment that he showed God by not shaving his head. As always has been and always will be the case, the true source of power is God and God alone. May we never fail to realize this and give him the credit he deserves. That's what I have. I sped up because I didn't think there was any way I was going to get through it, but take your extra 8 minutes and visit.